The publication of Edward Robinson's Biblical Researches in Palestine, Mount Sinai, and Arabia Petraea in 1841 established the basis upon which the first of the great paradigms within which archaeological research in Palestine would be conducted. Robinson's demonstration that many 19th century Arabic place names preserved a direct semantic link with towns and cities known from the biblical narratives launched a dramatic and intense period of archaeological investigation. During the last half of the 19th century, archaeological energy was almost totally directed toward the creation of accurate and comprehensive maps of the region, in the conviction that most, if not all, of Palestine's ancient cities and towns were to be identified with contemporary Arabic towns, villages, and kirbits. The discovery that the region's tells were the remains of ancient cities radically altered this essentially two-dimensional understanding of the Palestinian archaeological record and set the stage for the development of a new paradigm for archaeological research in the region. Events elsewhere in the Near East and the classical world also played an important role in changing this situation. In the 1870s, Heinrich Schliemann's search for the city of Troy led to the discovery that the tell Hisarlik was a layer cake of one city resting upon another. Furthermore, the late 19th century discovery of libraries filled with clay tablets dating to the biblical periods, buried in the great Mesopotamian and Egyptian tells, caused speculation that similar materials might well be recovered from Palestine. In the late 1880s, this idea was championed by the noted Assyriologist Archibald Henry Sayce, who proposed that similar tablets should also be a part of the Palestinian archaeological record. Sayce contended that if a goal of research was to determine the history and culture of ancient Palestine, there could be no better source than ancient documents describing contemporary life. Such tablets had been found in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Why not also in Palestine? The logical place to look, he argued, would be at sites which had been major cities during biblical times, but were not currently occupied. With a newly published Survey of Western Palestine, it was now possible to predict the likely locations for buried repositories, as well as other artifacts capable of further illuminating the life and culture of ancient Israel and Canaan. This was precisely the basis upon which the officers of the Palestine Exploration Fund decided to sponsor a major excavation project. After considerable discussion, the fund chose to focus its efforts on two sites at the edge of the Shephelah, Lachish and Kirbet Ajlan, which were then the generally accepted locations for the ancient cities of Lachish and Eglon. In their choice of this location at which to seek such materials, the fund was consciously drawing upon the past half-century's rigorous efforts to reconstruct the biblical landscape, and thus stood solidly within the paradigm of archaeological research established by Edward Robinson some 5 decades earlier. For the director of this new enterprise, the fund lured the famed Egyptian archaeologist William Matthew Flinders Petrie across the desert to excavate in Palestine. From his experience in Egypt, Petrie possessed a rudimentary understanding of ceramic chronology and a knowledge of the most advanced excavation techniques of the time. Petrie arrived in Palestine in the spring of 1890, and, after several weeks of what seemed to Petrie protracted negotiations regarding the exact location and conditions of the Firman, Petrie began his field investigations at the site of Lachish. He described his early work here in a letter written to the fund. I began work at Lachish, but 3 days' work there were amply enough to prove its late date, as I had supposed at my first view of it. Kirbet Ajlan seemed far more unpromising than Lachish. Only a few stray scraps of late pottery lay strewn about, and there does not seem to be any depth of soil. But Tel el-Hesi, from its height and the pre-Greek style of its pottery seemed to me to be a very promising site. Frederick Jones Bliss has provided us with a striking description of Petrie's activities. Pocket knife in hand, he climbed the steep slope to the east, where, owing to the encroachment of the stream during the course of ages, a section of the artificial mound had been practically laid bare. The story of the site was suggested in outline by fragments of pottery of various ages, some strewing on the surface, others dislodged from the side, as well as by the indications of strong walls of mud brick, not easily to be distinguished by the ordinary observer from natural unworked soil, but clear enough to Petrie's eye, and clearer still after a little scraping with the pocket knife. This story, thus hinted early, grew daily clearer through the course of the brilliant campaign of 6 weeks, during which Dr. Petrie personally superintended the trench work of some 30 diggers. When these deserted him for the joys of the harvest, our archaeologist, relying for his chronological data chiefly on the pottery, was in a position to maintain that Tel el-Hesi represented the site of a strongly fortified town, founded in the dim ages before the Hebrew conquest, and occupied with more or less continuity almost until the period of the Seleucidan kings. In other words, the history of the place was found to run parallel with that of Lachish, and, accordingly, the arguments for their identity, strong before the excavations, were placed on a firm archaeological basis. During these excavations, Petrie single-handedly supervised a staff of about 30 adult male workers who carried out the actual site excavation, as well as 30 women and girls who hauled dirt for disposal under the watchful eye of the antiquities inspector of the Ottoman government. The men were paid at a rate of 9 piastres a day, and the women at a rate of 5 piastres a day. As such participants, the local inhabitants ceased to be informants who could provide essential data and insight into the interpretation of the region's archaeological record, and became mute laborers carrying out the instructions of foreign researchers. As a result of his analysis of the ceramic materials, Petrie rejected the philologically derived identification of Lachish with biblical Lachish, and asserted in its place the identification of Tel el-Hesi as ancient Lachish. By basing his judgment of the site's ancient identity on the nature of the ceramic materials he recovered, Petrie simultaneously pressed the Robinson paradigm beyond its limits and established the first major element of its replacement. Given what he wrote to the project's sponsors, there can be little doubt that Petrie himself was aware of the significance of this new development. The great scarcity of small antiquities and the rarity of any regular stonework makes these excavations seem barren after those in Egypt. Yet every fragment bearing on the history of art in Palestine is of great value from its very rarity, and the present results just described fill a wide space in our architectural knowledge, which has hitherto been a blank. Another matter of importance in itself, and of inestimable value for future exploration, is the fixing of a scale of dated pottery. Poor as Tel el-Hesi is in some respects, it is full of potsherds, and the chance of such a grand section as the one of the east faced, from top to bottom, gives us at one stroke a series of all the varieties of pottery over 1,000 years. We now know for certain the characteristics of Amorite pottery, of earlier Jewish and of later Jewish influenced by Greek trade, and we can trace the importation and the influence of Phoenician pottery. In future, all the tells and ruins of the country will at once reveal their age by the potsherds which cover them. Petrie was to emphasize this assessment again in his report of excavations. The excavations at Tel el-Hesi proved to be an ideal place for determining the history of pottery in Palestine. And once settle the pottery of a country, and the key is in our hands for all future excavations. After his 6 weeks at Tel el-Hesi, Petrie prepared his final report and returned to Egypt. He suggested that the site was exhausted, since its identification and chronology were known. But the fund, strengthened in its belief that tablets were to be found, decided to continue work at the site. The fund found a replacement for Petrie in Frederick Jones Bliss, the son of the president of the Syrian Protestant College in Beirut. Since Bliss had no formal background in archaeology, he was sent to Egypt to train with Petrie before starting work at Hesi. Bliss provided an account of how he organized his excavations. All that could be gained from shafts and pits and cuttings had been learned by Dr. Petrie's work. Therefore, nothing remained for me to do but the arduous task of cutting down the mound. I found that to cut down the whole mound and carefully examine it all would be too much. So I decided to cut out 1/3 of it, layer by layer, which involved the removal of more than 500,000 cubic feet of earth. When you remember that we found needles, and indeed smaller objects, you can imagine what a tremendous task it was. I soon found that the hill consisted of layers, and that the base of each layer could be determined by the foundation of the mud brick buildings as they appeared. During his 2 years at the site, Bliss excavated through about 60 feet of stratified debris to the sterile sands below the earliest occupation. These excavations refined certain of Petrie's chronological insights and provided a wealth of artifactual data illustrative of the ancient culture of the site's inhabitants. Bliss's report demonstrated to his contemporaries that Tel el-Hesi was a mound composed of at least 11 superimposed cities, which had been successively constructed, occupied, and destroyed over a period of more than 15 centuries. He even found an Amarna period tablet, a find which came at a particular fortuitous moment when funds for the project were near exhaustion. It convinced Sayce and other influential backers that there was a near certainty of finding a library, and funding was acquired to finish the project. By all accounts, however, and certainly by his own estimation, Bliss's most significant discovery was mirrored in the title of the publication of the excavation results, A Mound of Many Cities. Bliss was able to draw plans of many of the cities, illustrate the artifacts he found associated with each city, and through his refinement of Petrie's ceramic chronology, he was able to date each city with some degree of precision. This was revolutionary. The goals and research methods of Petrie and Bliss were readily accepted by their contemporaries and immediate successors. So much so that almost all subsequent archaeological discussions centered primarily on the refinement of Bliss's ceramic chronology. Nevertheless, after a half-century of subsequent research, no less an authority than William Foxwell Albright paid a tribute to the acumen of Bliss's pioneering chronological expertise when he stated that, in retrospect, it is interesting to note that Bliss's chronology of the site, as presented in his book A Mound of Many Cities, is correct within a century from the top level down to the second stratum. Considered individually, the contributions of Petrie and Bliss at Tel el-Hesi were of major importance. By arguing that particular styles and shapes of ceramic vessels were associated with specific chronological and cultural periods, Petrie established ceramic chronology. By his careful isolation of particular segments of the site's occupation, Bliss demonstrated the viability and necessity of stratigraphic excavation. When considered together, the effect of their work at this site was revolutionary. The combination of ceramic chronology and site stratigraphy allowed researchers to escape from the chronologically static, two-dimensional view of the archaeological record. Together, ceramic chronology and site stratigraphy provided a three-dimensional matrix within which questions of culture definition and culture change could be addressed. Artifacts recovered from particular sites could now be placed into a chronological as well as a spatial context. This three-dimensional matrix was almost immediately perceived to be a much more appropriate context within which to consider questions about particular biblical personalities, places, and events. It would be simply a matter of developing the proper procedures for carrying on investigations within this new context. This optimism, which was to pervade much of the archaeological research of the next century, rested upon the strength of the assumptions which Bliss had made regarding both the formation of the archaeological record present at Tell's and the integrity of the stratigraphic units contained within them. In his classic summary of Palestinian archaeology, The Development of Palestine Exploration, Bliss provided the archaeological community with a succinct statement of his understanding of the processes forming the archaeological record. The first inhabitants, having chosen a site, rear on the rock or the virgin soil their constructions of bricks, formed of clay dried in the sun, usually made with straw. When the first occupation falls into ruins, through war, age, or temporary abandonment, the conditions are as follows. The lower portions of the wall remain in situ, but are surrounded and buried by fallen upper portions, that is, by precisely the same material as that of which they are made, and, what is more important, by precisely the same material as is to be used in the next construction. The rough platform thus formed furnishes a ready-made foundation. The second town rises on the ruins of the first, with no necessary interference with its ground plan. Moreover, the objects left in the ruins of the first town, vessels, weapons, tablets, are completely buried by the buildings of the second town, and thus remain intact forever, or at least till the excavator of future ages may discover them. This process may go on for centuries, until we have a perpendicular series of towns, as at Lachish, where, as already stated, the excavator was able to furnish partial plans of 8 distinct occupations, covering a period of some 12 or 15 centuries. Plans where the walls in the various occupations are along different lines, are sharply distinguished in each case from those below, and do not interfere with these. And in considering his work at Hesse, Bliss concluded, "The work at Tel el-Hesse was chiefly valuable for its lessons of hope. To prove the undisturbed stratification, and to know that each layer contained the objects left there by the inhabitants of each level, was a great point gained." It was this model of the formation of the archaeological record that enabled the next century of researchers to combine ceramic chronology and stratigraphic excavation into programs of investigation designed to identify and to investigate the region's ancient urban centers. To be sure, site identifications based on philological analysis and biblical scholarship were still an important part of this continuing effort. Now, however, rather than being forced to rely solely on philologically derived site identifications, researchers were provided with an independent counterbalance. Henceforth, the proposed identifications for biblical sites would be supported or challenged on the basis of archaeological chronology, and archaeological chronology was to be based on ceramics, preferably ceramics recovered from controlled stratigraphic excavations. The fact that excavations had the added benefit of producing large quantities of other artifacts which could be used to illustrate biblical history and culture was not lost on subsequent investigators. While the work of Petrie and Bliss at Tel el-Hesse inaugurated a new era in archaeological investigation, the strategies, methodologies, and techniques appropriate to stratigraphic analysis and ceramic chronology were not immediately apparent, nor were the consequences this would have on the way in which the archaeological enterprise came to be structured. It would take an additional 7 decades and the expenditure of untold millions of dollars to develop the skills and experience necessary to bring these aspects of the Petrie Bliss paradigm to maturity. Notwithstanding this lengthy period of subsequent development, it is no overstatement to assert that the summary of archaeological methods and goals set forth by Bliss in 1903 prefigured the basic outline for archaeological survey and excavation throughout the 20th century.